The household part 2. It was the pages of this chamber who served the Sultan directly, and from whom he selected those that were in constant attendance. Already in 1433, Bertrand de la Broquière had observed Murad II leave his room in the old palace at Edirne with only those boys who accompany him to the door of the chamber, suggesting that by this date the Sultan already chose a retinue from the lads of the privy chamber. Menevino, in the early 16th century, stated that the Sultan's principal and favorite pages of the chamber are only 3, defining them as the cloth-bearer, who continually gives him to drink and brings his clothes which he needs in the rain, the water-bearer, who brings his water wherever he goes, and shirts to change into, and the weapons-bearer, who carries his bows, arrows and sword and apos. In the second grade were 15 boys who make the bed, sweep, make the fire and similar things and apos. In the next century and a half, the organization of the privy chamber seems not, in its essentials, to have changed. The number of pages in attendance seems to have increased slightly. Ramberty in 1548 mentions 6, and Babavai in 1658 mentions 4, the weapons-bearer, the cloth-bearer, the stirrup-bearer and the turban-lord, and the total number of boys in the chamber had increased by the mid-17th century to 40. A page who had graduated from the larder to the privy chamber had before him the prospect of a career in the highest offices of the empire, the privy chamber itself in some respects symbolizing the ideals of sultanic government. A page could serve there only if he had caught the eye of the Sultan, and preferment within it depended entirely on royal patronage. The pages themselves were slaves, who performed the most menial tasks for their master, whether practical or ceremonial. At the same time, they occupied a position of immense privilege, since proximity to the Sultan meant proximity to the greatest source of power and patronage. Equally, the pages, who attended most directly on the Sultan, could converse with him, and, to some degree, control the information which he received. In this way, they could begin to exercise political power. Babavai noted, in particular, the special position of the chief barber who shaved the Sultan daily, and therefore, unlike the Grand Vizier, had the opportunity to speak to him every day. The privy chamber was, in fact, a microcosm of how the sultans governed. A page might graduate from the palace to become a governor or vizier and use his links to the palace to his political advantage, but he could never forget that he was also a slave who was dependent on the sultan's patronage for advancement, and was equally liable, at the sultan's behest, to abasement and execution. The pages of the chamber were not the only residents of the palace, although they were the ones who came regularly into close contact with the sultan and were, for this reason, the most likely to receive preferment in the world outside. They could also graduate to offices within the palace, which again brought them face to face with the sultan, for example, as master of the standard, who kept the flags and banners of the sultan's army, as master of the stable who, already, in Menevino's day, had under him 900 men, and who assisted the sultan to mount his horse, or as head gatekeeper, in command of, in Menevino's day, 500 and, in 1600, over 2,000, gatekeepers, who formed a military corps, guarding the palace gates and carrying out executions. There were other officers of the palace with privileged access to the sultan, the head falconer and master of the hounds, who would accompany him on the hunt, and especially the head gardener. The gardeners of the palace, as their name implies, worked in the palace gardens, producing flowers, fruit and vegetables for consumption in the palace and for sale. They were also soldiers, and acted as royal bodyguards. Indeed, during the Janissary revolt of 1622, which ended with the murder of Osman II, 1618-22, the Janissaries hesitated before entering the palace for fear of encountering the armed gardeners. The head gardener also had, from before Menevino's day, until the late 18th century, jurisdiction of the shores of the Bosphorus up to the Black Sea. He was also helmsman of the Sultan's barge, and it was in this capacity, Babavai emphasizes, that he was in the privileged position of speaking to the Sultan during royal excursions by boat. There were numerous other hierarchies of slaves in the palace: cooks, pastry cooks, stewards who carried food from the kitchens to the Sultan's apartment or to other parts of the palace, water carriers, woodcutters who chopped and carried wood, novice janissaries, chavushes who conveyed people to the Sultan, acted as marshals during ceremonies and carried imperial decrees to addresses outside the capital, and so on. For all their order and decorum, the three courts of the palace and the secluded world of the harem were as crowded and prone to epidemics as the cramped quarters of the city outside the walls of the permanent residence in the palace. The most powerful, until the last decade of the 16th century, was probably the chief white eunuch. This was the Aga of the Gate, whom the Sultan promoted From among the eunuchs of the inner palace, the law book attributed to Mehmed II names him as the preferred channel for petitions to the throne, giving him the opportunity to influence both the petitioners and the Sultan. From the late 16th century, however, he seems to have lost some of his influence to the chief black eunuch, who bore the title of Aga of the Abode of Felicity, or, more colloquially, Aga of the Girls. The eunuchs of the third court were white, while those of the harem were black, and the political influence of the chief black eunuch began to rise in the late 16th century, when the size of the harem grew and the powerful queen mothers took up residence there. As the only senior officer of the court with access to both the male and female worlds of the palace, the Aga of the Girls became an important political figure. Babavai comments, "This black officer is more important than the white Aga of the Gate, because, in addition to greater revenues, he has easier access to the prince, and more occasions to approach him at any hour, even when he is retired, with his mistress. These are the men who direct the best part of the affairs of the empire, and, while they have perhaps never left the palace, which they entered when very young, they give advice on state interests and use the favorable ear of the master at will to their own liking."